When I made a video earlier in the year chronicling my journey through the mainline Armoured Core games as a newcomer to the series, something funny about the response stuck out to me. Namely, in amongst the genuinely overwhelming positivity that video received, a welcome surprise in itself, many people seemed legitimately confused about my own preferences for certain games, certain generations over others, proudly proclaiming that, in fact, this game was considered the pinnacle of the series by the community at large. It's just that, well, no one could seemingly land on what this game actually is. It seemed like every single response to that effect listed a different title among the countless releases over the years. You know, it's odd you were so positive about 4 Answer, the community thinks 3 is best. Or you liked 3, that one sucks. The community prefers the slower feel of 2. Last Raven is the community favourite. No, Silent Line is the community favourite. No, Nexus is the favourite. And it's interesting because since the release of the gameplay footage of the upcoming Armoured Core 6 Fires of Rubicon at Summer Game Fest in June, it feels as if there's been a tonal shift regarding the conversation around this game, especially compared to the fervour you saw around the reveal trailer at the Game Awards. A whole lot of analysis has been poured into 4 minutes of random footage and how worried the community is about stuff they've heard regarding lock-on, checkpoints, healing. This isn't the Armoured Core the community wants. FromSoft is changing everything about the series. And look, to a certain extent, I get it. This is a series that has met with widespread critical indifference over the years. And the day ones, so to speak, those fans who saw the genius of this franchise from the very beginning, putting in that work these games have always demanded to be truly loved, I at least understand the impulse of those people getting a little defensive when everyone else is spouting the same "is this going to be Souls?" talking points. But my point with all of this is, as someone who went through the series in a fairly condensed period of time relatively recently, and came to love every entry for different reasons, the one thing I can say that defines Armoured Core is that it's very hard to define Armoured Core. Sure, they're mech games with an emphasis on player customization, but other than that, this series has seen drastic changes between entries, in aesthetic, control, game feel, and yes, even difficulty and accessibility to a certain extent. This is a constantly evolving series, and as previously mentioned, the community can't really seem to agree on what evolution in particular is the truly definitive one. And so, with all of that preamble in mind, there's only really one metric regarding the upcoming title that I can truly rely on at this stage. That being the fact that in the 4 hours I got to play hands-on with Armoured Core 6 at a Bandai Namco hosted preview event a few weeks back, I had an absolute blast. That time flew by, and by the end of it, I certainly had a lot of thoughts, with some small potential concerns, but ultimately, I was gutted to have to put the controller down. I was desperate for more. I don't know where the game goes after the build I played, but whether or not you think the final game ends up conforming to your own personal ideal of what an Armoured Core game should be, which again is all you can really rely on, to me, Fires of Rubicon really feels like something special, like it's going to be the revitalization of a long languishing franchise. An entry that for some players I think might take some getting used to, but I do think will ultimately see many trepidatious fans have those worries quashed fairly quickly once the game actually releases next month. While there are elements of its design that might strike you as odd initially, I came away from this preview with the distinct impression that Fires of Rubicon, if anything, represents a celebration of the unique characteristics of almost every entry in the series. The speed of 4th gen Armoured Core with the relative heft of 3, the environmental density and verticality of 5 with the cyber-tinged industrial infrastructure of 2. Plus those quality of life features that apparently have people so worried. They're certainly different, but as we'll come on to, they don't detract from the game's overall challenge whatsoever. If anything, they add to the systemic melange that makes these games so tense and exciting. And moreover, that claim I made in my original video, when we only had the reveal trailer to go on, that this cinematic was still impressive because the final game would probably end up playing like this, well, it absolutely does. As such, as a recent series convert and now fanatic, Armoured Core 6 is still far and away my most eagerly anticipated title of the year. That excitement I previously had for the game has only grown since playing this chunk of it. and it was a pretty sizable chunk at that. Given that Armoured Core games aren't typically known for being particularly long, part of me was curious to see how significant a portion of 6 I would be able to get through in 4 hours. It turns out that this preview build, comprising 11 full missions, interlaced with bite-sized optional training levels, arena fights and the like, represents but the introductory chapter of Fires of Rubicon alone. If what Bandai Namco was saying about the game is true, this rather hefty segment of the playtime barely scratches the surface of what's to come. And I guess that's just it. If I came away from my time with Armoured Core 6 with one sentiment in my head, it would be epic. Not in the Reddit epic bacon moment sense, but in sheer scale. Don't get me wrong, if you've played Armoured Core before, then the mission structure won't surprise you too much. You know, pick a mission from a menu, go into a bespoke, largely linear arena, and clear out the threats before you, then head back to the garage to reap the rewards of your struggles via vast customization options. But trust me when I say that everything about Fires of Rubicon feels so much bigger when compared to prior titles. And this is most obviously apparent in the level design, where even the heightened focus on prolonged, fast flight will only usually take you so far across these massive stretches of land, oftentimes filled with hostiles in amongst the debris and the enemy fortresses constructed in its wake to keep you busy on the way to your objective. The overall visual palette is akin to any FromSoft release really, where raw graphical fidelity perhaps takes a backseat to prioritizing smooth framerate and art direction, but god, where the endless barren expanses of 4th gen Armoured Core served a narrative purpose, and the environmental density of 5th gen was geared towards encouraging more measured tactical gameplay, here we see the best of both worlds, narrative and tactics working in tandem with one another, importantly coupled with a visual panache that the series has yet to see up to this point. There are moments where I just look out into the distance, the sun setting on this icy landscape, these almost impossible webs of endless pipe and steel and steam, in awe of how majestic it all looked. A feeling I can't really remember experiencing so distinctly in prior AC titles, before realizing that not only was all of this aiding in gameplay, you know, providing a flexibility in approach to your objectives, a verticality and expansiveness to environments that often let you attack these missions in a variety of different ways, but also telling a very distinct story. Because even that narrative feels bigger, much more prominent this time around. I mean, look, this isn't suddenly a grand departure from the rather roundabout fashion in which FromSoft has always told their stories in these games. You aren't suddenly getting a super coherent plot thrown your way without first having to wade through a cavalcade of factions and abbreviations you couldn't possibly know about intuitively, including one, as an aside, whose constant appearance in all capital lettering had me trying and failing to stifle my laughter as I realised that categorically no Scottish person had their hands on this game's localization, otherwise this would have been flagged immediately. What struck me in this build, however, is that if prior AC titles definitely played into this idea that your mercenary status and mission objectives therein might place you in uncomfortable proximity to the ideals of these world-destroying corporations, here there's almost a sense of tragedy to the whole thing. Typically, AC games place you in a world long after any beauty has been ripped from the soil. Here, while you are definitely working in the wake of a particularly devastating cataclysm, this landscape isn't so wholly absent of that beauty just yet. The very opening cutscene reveals your character to have essentially fallen victim to the Human Plus project. That scenario where if you fell far enough into debt, you would be forced to restart your campaign, only this time with a nice augment thanks to your oh-so-kind paymasters, gradually whittling down your humanity and turning you into a piece of property. The mission that sends you down to the surface of Rubicon in the first place is clandestine, seemingly off the books. I guess an attempt by you and your handler to essentially get enough money to buy your life back from the corporations. Already an ethical and moral mess that only gets more complicated when in mission you see yourself very much characterized as an invading force, steamrolling and corrupting this environment in real time, with its denizens begging you to stop. A mission where you have to take on a new type of machine is built up to be this worrying new development in the enemy's combat capabilities, only for the fight itself to become a rather trivial back and forth. One of the shorter missions I played, as radio intercepts reveal the pilot inside to be something of a rookie, the shakiness of their voice revealing their fear as you mercilessly strike them down. All this to say, clearly Fires of Rubicon, as with many AC titles before it, isn't afraid to mess with your expectations, and especially with the narrative reveals that happened towards the end of this build that I can't talk about here for fear of spoilers, I am fascinated to see how this narrative focus manifests in the hours that follow. But don't let a battle like the one I just mentioned fool you. Yes, the rather story-focused mission I just mentioned could be described as trivial, but the vast majority of the rest of this preview build's skirmishes proved to be anything but, retaining that ferocity that makes AC combat so viscerally compelling, while also introducing nuances that represent the most interesting update to this gameplay model in quite some time. With the often blinding speed of movement as you boost and fly around these environments with what looks like very little effort, the immediate point of comparison I found myself drawing was to 4th gen Armoured Core, with things like your boost meter regenerating so quickly while on the ground that even expending it fully felt like it came with exceedingly little punishment, at least initially. This is a game that highlights flight above all else, with some of the more challenging enemies mainly just requiring a shift in mindset, that carefully managing your meter to stay in the air as long as possible is often enough to get the jump on a great many enemies. But that's just it. Where those 4th gen games largely saw me anyway, simply trying to keep up with the enemies whizzing around the screen while giving them all barrels at all times, here there is indeed a more tactical bent to these still breathless encounters. Enemies have something resembling a stagger bar in Fires of Rubicon, where you whittle down their armor to open them up for a brief period of increased damage. For most grunt enemies, this doesn't make much material difference beyond simply draining their health with your typical barrage, but there are some foes that require a little more finesse in your maneuvering and flanking, utilising certain types of weapons in just the right order to break down their defences before going in for that killer blow. There's a weight, a heft to these animations and controls that turn this into what feels like the most comprehensive AC combat system yet. A violent visual ballet where every enemy destroyed feels well earned and oh so satisfying, but similarly where every movement has to be carefully calculated and thought out, just at an absolutely dizzying pace. And trust me, when you really get into the heat of some of these battles, that couple of seconds for your boost bar to fill up that initially seemed so nothingy can grow to feel like an eternity. And nowhere is this more apparent than in the boss fights. While even the smaller ones are larger, more menacing than your typical AC encounter, some take the scale you saw in the arms forts of For Answer and blow them up to an almost incomprehensible size, with the camera zooming out to show you just how tiny you are by comparison, and where merely ascending such a behemoth constitutes a level unto itself, with seemingly multiple routes for you to take, and crucially, a trust placed in your grip on the traversal mechanics to find that way up yourself. Because here's where we get to the elephant in the room. I've seen people express worries that in this day and age, where mass market appeal matters more than ever, that this series, known for its obstinance, its grit, its challenge and strategy, might have those edges sanded down, that it might be made easier purely for the sake of drawing in as many people as possible. And like I say, to an extent, I can at least understand this impulse. That idea that you had to fight against your own mech to really master it was not only a key part of why I loved those older games, it arguably formed the central pillar of their storytelling, that these worlds are cruel and uncaring and you have to be on your A game at all times in order to fend off the grabbing hands of your corporate paymasters who not only destroyed the earth, but now want to destroy you and turn you into their property. I get why someone might view an attempt to de-harsh the gameplay narrative of these titles so to speak, as a little dubious. But take it from me, as exemplified by the end boss of the very first mission absolutely obliterating me my first time through, as well as several instances that saw me having to repeatedly retry sections for the majority of my playtime, what Armoured Core 6 proves is that increased quality of life doesn't always mean reduced difficulty. These bosses in particular represented a wall that many fellow previewers around me, perhaps inexperienced with this still niche and complicated series, proved unable to surmount. I think the reps said that only a few people throughout the day were able to beat, let alone see, the entire build. Personally, I got to the final preview boss, but wasn't quite able to best it in the allotted time. It's hard to say at this stage just how the overall difficulty of Fires of Rubicon will stack up against other entries in the series. Right now, I'd compare it to something like the later stages of 3 in that regard. But don't get it twisted, AC6 has, indeed, softened a lot of those barriers to entry for new players. But this game is still unafraid to grind you into the dirt if you're not able to get on board with its vision, with each new quality of life feature bringing with it as many in-mission tactical concerns as it does immediate benefits. Healing is probably the most obvious one to start with, given how wholly it seems to go against the notion that in these games you pick what you pick and deal with the consequences. In 6's case, my guess is that healing was introduced to counteract the effect of slightly longer missions compared to prior entries. We aren't talking the massive, exhausting half-hour skirmishes found in something like 5, but we also aren't talking the bite-sized chunks of combat seen in 1 through 4. Surviving even this long on a single health bar is a daunting prospect, and so you may need that little boost every so often. But let me emphasize that it is a little boost. It is not the get out of jail free card you might think it is. These limited repair kits can't be spammed, there's a cooldown, and what's more, you can't use one and fire a weapon at the same time as far as I can remember. To heal is a short but nonetheless conscious process, which given the aforementioned speed of these fights and the ability for the balance to tip against you in a moment, isn't a process to be undertaken lightly. I'm not sure if the limited charges per mission can be upgraded alongside other parts of your core or not, but at least in the early stages of what I played, these repair kits would allow me to take 1, maybe 2 extra hits during those more chaotic situations in which I would really need them. If anything, like I say, it became one more strategic consideration to take into account, adding to the maelstrom of systems I needed to keep an eye on, checking to see if I had enough time between missile flurries to pop a kit. Arguably, the ability to heal, much like the new lock-on mechanic, which you can either use or not use, both choices have their own purpose in terms of how you want to spread out your missile barrage, for example. All of this added to the moment-to-moment tension of encounters rather than reducing it. Similarly, checkpoints. Now, especially in the context of what limited time I had in the preview, the fact that I didn't have to restart an entire mission every time I messed up certainly took a bit of the edge off of certain battles, particularly seeing as some of these end-of-level bosses might feasibly see you retrying them dozens of times. But this isn't to say that I never had to restart an entire mission, far from it. Like, say you're coming up against a tough boss, and as in older AC games, you're getting the feeling that your current loadout isn't cutting it. It's time for a change-up. Now, while Fires of Rubicon does let you access the garage to this effect upon failure, what it doesn't let you access is the shop. If you want to change anything on your mech mid-mission, you need to have purchased that equipment before even entering the mission. Otherwise, you're left with 2 choices. Keep hammering against this foe in a potentially futile endeavour, or quit out of the mission entirely. Head to the shop, hum and haw over not only the most minute of stats across dozens of individual pieces of equipment, as has always been so fun in these games, but also your now even more stretched resources. Similarly to the 3rd gen games, not only does 6 stop you from selling off absolutely everything as you could do in the earliest AC games, you now essentially require enough credits to cover 2 full loadouts, just in case you want to experiment, to mix and match mid-mission again down the line. So yeah, checkpoints are absolutely welcome, but like healing, they don't simply make the game easier. If anything, they rendered those instances where I did have to go back to the shop all the more gut-wrenching gut-wrenching for the progress I was consciously sacrificing in the name of combat versatility. I hope you get my point here. This is still Armoured Core at its, well, core. The grim beauty of this franchise is still readily abundant, and it's not as if new players suddenly have zero barriers to entry. This is still a really difficult game at times. I just think that some of these features will see less new players bouncing right the hell off before they can experience that beauty for themselves. And I don't know, that only seems like a good thing to me. But that's not to say that I didn't pick up on a couple of quibbles during those few hours myself. Weirdly, the one problem I do foresee with some of these more structural changes to combat, for example, and this might sound incredibly nitpicky, but it's the narrative consistency of the whole affair. Given that the world building of this series is so thorough, so comprehensive, it seems to me only fair to ask the question of, wait, how did my core change weapon loadouts mid-mission after destruction? You know, for all of Armoured Core 5's numerous problems, its mid-mission resupplies, for example, were explicitly handled by you. You made the decision. You paid the price at the end of a mission. Now, it's obviously hard to tell how this shift might pan out across the entire game, but the Sherpas, as your handler calls them, here served less a strategic role as much as they became a fairly arbitrary indicator that you were about to enter a big boss battle. You know, why did the handler decide that this specific part of this specific mission was a good time to resupply, but not those other parts of those other missions? And speaking of, those bosses aren't without their issues too. They do function pretty differently here, more obviously coming down to things like pattern recognition. They have distinct phases that shift when you get their health bar down to half. I guess part of the charm of old AC bosses is that, well, they often weren't bosses in the traditional sense. Their menace was heightened by the fact that they didn't have giant health bars or anything. In the heat of battle, and with some exceptions, they appeared as any other machine, just like you, only more. More armor, more weapons, more agility. The fact that they didn't have these distinct boss-like movesets a lot of the time made their appearance during missions all the less predictable, meaning you had to stay on your toes pretty constantly in terms of reflexes and resource management. You were never fully sure how far along a battle you actually were, making it all the more satisfying when you'd frantically spend those last few bullets hoping for the best and they'd go down. And as glorious as the encounters in this preview were, it's hard not to think of them by comparison as somewhat staged. Those more intimate battles with regular pilots still exist. There's just a much more prevalent barrier placed between them and capital B boss fights. But look, even with those minor concerns, none of it hindered the fact that I haven't been able to stop thinking about all of these little moments of that preview since I played it. I have been positively giddy to share all of this with you, and there's still so much that I can't talk about. Like, this is a preview event that saw me hungry, dehydrated, exhausted from early morning travel, spending hours walking around London in a futile effort to dodge heatwave temperatures before the preview event itself. Trust me, I was not in the best of moods going into this thing, and the time I got to spend with the game still blew me away. You can see it from the sheer number of comparisons I've drawn between Fires of Rubicon and other entries in the series here. This first chapter alone formed an incredibly exciting opening salvo of systems that, sure, do introduce new bells and whistles to bring Armoured Core into the modern age after almost a decade since its last release, but also shocked me in how deeply they appear to celebrate just what makes this series so special. Now, we'll see how these opinions shift with the full release on August 25th, which I will do my best to review in a timely manner. August is a busy month, but for now, based solely on the limited build I played, I think that if longtime AC fans can perhaps get on board with this idea that Armoured Core is a series defined by constant evolution, they will find a title here that is just as rewarding as this glorious franchise has always been. So yeah, thanks to Bandai Namco for inviting me to the preview and flying me down to check the game out, and thank you so much for watching. Be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, all that daft YouTube stuff. It really helps the channel and it means the world. A massive thanks as well to my patrons, who you can see on screen and are all getting access to exclusive, fully produced videos that aren't available here. Your continued support is what allows me to keep going with the work I do on this channel in a sustainable way, and I seriously cannot express how grateful I am for that. You are all the best. Special thanks go to Mark B. Writing, Artyom Vitsyuk, Mel Meek, Michael Tritt, Rickety Cricket, Cameron Sinisteros, Urban Cheese, Charles J. Liu, Alistair Dunn, Vitautis Catharsis, Dolly Bowman, Young Condor, David Karstens, Tom Webster, Danis Sikauskis, Jordan Midler, Christopher Faherty, Nicholas Villeneuve, Ruth Knapman, Yogesh Deshpande, Leah Chinello, Captain Knusprich, Bryce Snyder, CPJ MLT Limited, David Björk, Timothy Jones, Matthew Grover, Tommy Carver Chaplin, Shardfire, Lynn Browning, Dallas Keane, Charlie Kimball, and Charlie Yang. And with that, this has been another episode of Writing on Games. Thank you all so much for watching, stay safe, and I will see you all next time.